G'day, welcome to Pay It Forward. Today, of course, I'm sharing with you a part of my little masterclass. You get a little sneaky peek into my masterclass. I'm sharing with you that beautiful horse from this month's masterclass trio. It's a beautiful patchwork horse. It's reminiscent of sort of little retro hobby horses in the 70s. I certainly remember them when I was a child. Just a beautiful little horse. You can even position all sorts of some of our other characters on it. Of course, we've got the beautiful cowboy in masterclass. If you want to make that, you can come and join me there. But this little horse is beautiful. It's easy to make, and it just is. It's a quilter's dream. It's a patchworker's dream because you can make it up in so many colours. You've got your free pattern in the drop-down. The link to your free pattern in the drop-down box below this video. Just see where it says see more, open it up, you'll find that link. Print out your own pattern templates on your own home printer. Do follow the blurb that I give you about printing, and always message us in the comments if you have any problems with printing. I include all seam allowances with all of my patterns, so you don't have to worry about any of that. So let's now get started making our beautiful little hobby horse. Let's have a look at what we're going to need to make our beautiful horse. It's a little vintage style horse that I personally grew up with, watching friends have these lovely little sort of horse buffets, they used to call them, in the 70s. I always wanted one. I didn't have one, but I had several friends who had them, and it stayed with me for years. Now, just for a point of reference, this is just to show you where this original idea came from. This is an original illustration of mine. And of course, in Masterclass, we're making the whole scenario there. But I'm creating here, we're creating a little version of that horse. So it's slightly different, but I'm keeping with the same colour tones, because of course I'm putting in the other characters with it. So you can do any kind of patchwork horse you like. They're very cute. They look amazing with a little bear sitting atop of them, and even better with our little masterclass bear on top. But certainly as a project just on their own, they're really lovely, and it's a good size to work with. So I'm making mine in felt, and I'm following all of these colours. I'm adding patches that are in this sort of giraffe print, because they match his little toy giraffe. This picture comes from a whole series of this little boy who has his giraffe friend who goes everywhere with him, and I always incorporate some of the giraffe print in with it. So I've created my own giraffe print out of pure wool felt with my airbrush that will be matching my giraffe in Masterclass. So, of course, you don't have to do that. You can use any kind of little patches you like. I just thought I'd give you that and show you that for reference. Okay, so let's get started on what we're going to need. We will start with the main body of the horse, and that is, you've got your two side body pieces. I'm using pure wool felt. This is actually a new felt, which is actually a little polka dot, which is beautiful. I have that interfaced with fusible woven, a medium weight cotton interfacing. Absolutely, you do need to interface this project. So there's your two side pieces. Then you have the front gusset piece. I'm using the blue, so I'm bringing in the blue, which is also in my project and illustration. This is your front gusset piece, and then you have a rear gusset piece. Again, they're all interfaced. Using the blue again, because I'm breaking it up and I'm making a patchwork sort of a situation there. We need a base. So the base in my illustration is a yellow that matches the muzzle of the horse. So beautiful yellow, again, pure wool felt. You can use washable acrylic felt for this project, and it will work just as well. I just am a bit of a felt snob these days, and I love my pure wool felt. Okay, so that's that base. That's also interfaced. And of course, I have the patches ready to go on those side body pieces as well. And you'll find that your body templates are marked with the right positioning to add those patches. So That's our body. We have a neck circle for the body as well that will go in, and our joint will go through that. So we'll talk about that joint now. We've got a 50mm neck joint, which makes putting this one together so much easier, and also it gives you a lovely clean neck joint, and it means you've got some posability. So that's your neck joint. On that body, we will be making a saddle. Now the saddle, you can of course appreciate that can be super colourful. The saddle is made separately and it is tied around on the underside, so it makes life much easier. So you've got your two saddle pieces, one for each side, and I've cut the underside of the saddle in another print. Still using felt for this, and they are still interfaced, those pieces. On those saddle pieces, just to match up with my illustration, I have a little red gingham heart. This is also pure wool felt, but it has fusible webbing applied, so that I'm going to be able to fuse that into place and applique around that. I'm going to need some type of ribbon or braid that will pop out at the bottom of each of those pieces of the saddle, and then it will tie up on the underneath, and this works well with my project. Of course, you can decorate the saddle any way you like. We'll be doing a bit of blanket stitching here and there, but overall quite a clean look for this project. So we also will need a tail for our horse, and I have put together a few strands of old-fashioned braided cord. The reason why I like using braided cord, and I definitely used it in my my pony, my unicorn pony as well, if you've seen that one, I like it because it unravels. So you can untwist it and you get a much fuller tail. We do that at the end. You can also use yarn. You can certainly use different coloured yarn. Again, I'm keeping to my colours. This is about 25 centimetres, but we will cut it down. Now let's have a look at the pieces we're going to need for the head. So for the head, we've got our two side head pieces and our two nose gusset pieces. See that I'm bringing in the yellow again. I've also got two patches to go on the side of the head. Again, it's tying in with the rest of the body, and as per my illustration, I have a centre head gusset which is in the yellow, so that's going to break it up. And all of these pieces are also interfaced. These pieces, your little patches, they are just my felt with fusible webbing applied. Then we look at the ears. So the ears with this one, I've got two sets of ears and one pair I mean. We've got the backing of the ear is the same purple as the head, and I've added a little pink interior, and I have both of those interfaced as well. So you've got your two ears there. I actually do have a little heart too for the chest of my little horse. You will need to fill the base of your horse with something to give it some weight. So you can use plastic pellets that are particularly made for toy filling. I will be using just clean aquarium gravel just to settle that base so it sits nice and firm. Remember that I've got a whole bunch of things going on top of mine. You're going to need some buttons for eyes. You can use actual teddy bear eyes if you like, but mine is following my illustration, so I'm going to have two blue buttons. I'm not sure which yet. Also two buttons, matching buttons for the nostrils. You will need extra strong thread for your construction, and also you'll need some kind of embroidery thread or pearl thread to do your applique around your patches, and also some pearl thread just to stitch in a very simple mouth, and of course polyester filling for filling your project, topping it up in the end. So that's about it. As I said, you don't have to use buttons for the eyes, but it does make it very simple, and it does mean we can get some good pull in at the side of the head. So let's get started, and we will start by making the body. The first step in starting to create the body of this lovely little horse is to take our side body pieces and we're going to press into place our patches. Now you can patch yours any way you like. I've given you the patches templates for them, and the sizing and the placement won't interfere with the saddle that sits down here, so that's why I've given you those templates. But you could go ahead and decorate it any way you like. I don't like anything interfering with the other pieces. Okay, so I've pressed into place these two patches and I'm going to mirror that on the opposite side. As I said, on your templates you will have the placement there. Also on the front gusset I've added the little heart and I've given you that placement as well. And if you follow my placement, it's not going to interfere with any of your seams or anything like that. So let me get these two pressed into place as well. And I will be doing that with a hot iron and a protective cloth. So now that I have all of my patches in place, I'm just going to move these two aside and I'm going to show you my stitching on one of these. And I am going to be sewing mine with a blanket applique stitch. I'm using pearl thread. I'm using a purple colour around these patches. I will change it up as I go, depending on the colours of the patch and how I think it will work. This is 8-ply pearl thread, which is fairly fine, which works better for your blanket applique stitch. You can also use, which I might in some areas, use your extra strong thread as an embroidery thread. I've got a single strand and a knot in the end. I'm going to start coming in from the underneath. I'm starting right on the edge of my shape here and bringing that needle through. I do have a video for the blanket applique stitch right here on my channel on Pay It Forward, and you will be able to see exactly how to do this, but I'm going to take you through a few stitches. So I'm holding that thread out of the way. I'm going to keep my stitches nice and small, so they're probably about 3 millimeters. I'm going to dive in. I'm taking up the shape, the fabric shape, and also the underside fabric, and I'm bringing my needle out through the base fabric. And I'm bringing my needle out through the loop, the thread loop, and I pull on that, and that's tucked that in. Now we're going to travel along just the length of one stitch. As I said, I'm going to keep them nice and small. I'm going to do the same thing, bring my needle out through the backing fabric, right on the edge of that shape, and bring my needle out through the loop. Pull on that, and what that's going to do is create a little binding stitch all the way around the edge of that shape, and it's also going to, of course, secure it to my fabric. And I'm going to get that lovely look of a blanket stitch all the way around the edge, so this won't be a raw edge anymore. So a couple more stitches for you to see. Make sure that as you work, you rotate your work so that all of your stitches are travelling straight out. Move your work as you go so that continues to fan out well. So I'm going to continue around until I have that stitched in place, and then I'm just going to repeat with all of my other pieces. I'll be stitching around this one in a red. I now have all of my little patches stitched into place. I will say you can do that stitching with a close zigzag stitch, satin stitch on your machine if you'd rather. Because I'm making this for a high-end collectible, of course I'm going to do all of that beautiful hand stitching. Now I've gone ahead too and added some extra little cross stitches in a contrasting colour. Again, it's lining up with my illustration, and a few little darning patches here and there, remembering where that saddle will sit. And it's just a little bit here and there, and it certainly does add to the whole patchwork look of this piece. And I've also added that heart on the front chest area. Now let's move ahead, and we're going to start putting this body together. The first thing you need to do is to sew that close zigzag stitch in between the marks across the top back, so that seam, that opening there is going to stay true. It won't stretch and it won't fray away. Okay, so now our first step is to put right sides together, and we're going to sew what is the centre back seam, but of course it's only a small part there because we've got our opening, and your seam allowance is 4mm. Just going to clip that in the middle and line up those pieces, and I'm going to overcast first, always overcast first, from the back of what is where the tail goes to that mark, and I'm going to sew that seam 2 times on the machine, 4mm seam allowance, and then from the mark there up to the neck edge the same. You can see now that I have sewn those 2 body pieces together at the top on that top centre seam, leaving that opening, sewn that 2 times with that 4mm seam allowance. I like to go ahead and take out my overcasting stitch from both sides. My reason for that is then I can open that seam out nice and flat and everything will sit better on that top line. It also means that joining on our next pieces, we're going to be able to really centre those seams. Okay, so turn it through, roll those seams out while you have good access to them, and now we can go ahead and start with our front body piece, and we're going to put right sides together. Make sure you are dealing with the front here, and you'll find that that piece will fit beautifully, and we are going to be working on the side body piece with both of these sides. The reason for that is it just will sit better, everything will turn through better, and the front will sit more even if you work on the side body piece, and always mirror sew in that way. What you do on one side you always do on the other. If you're not understanding what I mean, we don't do our sewing on the gusset piece, we do it on the side body piece. So I will overcast that, and then I will sew that 4mm seam allowance 2 times. I'll flip it over, again working on that side body piece, and I'll do the same with the opposite side. You can go ahead and turn those seams through and roll them out again while we have good access to those seams. So you've got a nice clean front there, and also on the top and bottom of those seams, each of them, I've removed the overcasting stitch again so that we can open those seams out nice and flat to correspond with our other pieces. So now we're going to add our centre back gusset. We're going to do that by taking a pin and putting it through, first of all, that mark we have. It's on your pattern templates. Put your pin through at your 4mm seam allowance. Remember, we can open this nice and flat. So now we're going to take our pin straight through at 4mm, straight through that centre back seam. Make sure that is well centred. Push that pin head all the way down, and then we're going to pin in. Take your pin through all of the layers, flip it over, and just take a little bit of fabric on the other side with your pin and push that pin head all the way down. It's just like pinning in a foot pad when we're making a bear. Flip over to the other side, and we're going to do the same. This is pinning in 3D. Makes everything much easier. Always push those pin heads all the way down. You'll find that this will line up perfectly with the other edge, and notice that I'm doing all of my work on this back gusset now. We're not working on the side panels now, we're working on that back gusset. Get that pinned and overcast into place. So that has my back gusset overcast in place. Everything's lined up beautifully, and while we would normally sew that in just straight up 2 times with our 4mm seam allowance, we're going to be adding a tail. So what we have to do, you can see there that I've marked just either side equally, just enough space for an opening for the tail to pass through, and I'm judging it based on the width of my tail. So depending on how much you've got to tuck in there, you'll just stitch then just up to those points, and do make sure you back and forth on your start and finish here so that this won't pull apart, and the same with the other side. You'll sew those seams 2 times as always with your 4mm seam allowance, and then we'll be able to take out our overcasting stitch and there'll be a little hole ready for us to add that tail. So again, you'll want to turn that one through and roll out those seams, and you can snip that overcasting thread and you can see we've got a little space there where the tail will poke through. I'm going to leave that for now though, the tail, we'll pop that in at the end. And you also, again, need to open up your overcasting stitch on the lower edge so we can open those seams out nice and flat. I'm going to turn that back through, and now we're going to add the base. It's a nice big piece, so it's quite easy to add this base, and we're putting it in by matching up our centre our centre mark with the front mark on your piece. This piece is all the same, so it doesn't have a back or a front. So we're going to take our pin at the 4mm seam allowance. Again, we're going to take it straight through, exactly matching those marks. And again, I'm going to pin that in 3D fashion. Turn it to the back and do the same thing, match up the back. Now if you've kept to all of your seam allowances, well, you'll find that this piece will fit in beautifully. So now I just start pinning that in. When I get to the seams like this, I press them nice and flat. Just makes everything sit better. Continue with that same pinning method. And I go from side to side, pinning that in place, and I'll get the whole piece put in. You can see that it'll fit absolutely perfectly, and it's a nice big piece, so it won't be awkward to work with. And you just simply overcast that whole piece in, and when you've done that, because this is a nice big piece, you can sew the entire thing in on the machine, the same 4mm seam allowance, and sew that seam 2 times. So there we go, that has that base all stitched in beautifully 2 times. Now we're going to go ahead and add the centre neck circle, which is your little round piece you have here. We are going to take a pin through anywhere on that circle, because it's a circle, it doesn't matter, straight through that seam allowance. And I like to start at the back centre seam and take my pin straight through, just as we did when we were pinning in the base. And then you're just going to make your way around, pinning in that same way that we did with the base in that 3D style. And again, if you followed all your seam allowances, you'll see that this little circle fits in perfectly without any easing or stretching. And that will tuck in there beautifully. You can go ahead then and just overcast that circle into place. Now that we have that little neck circle all stitched in with our overcasting stitch, we're actually going to sew it in properly and sew the seam. We can't do this on the machine because you'll never get a perfect circle on the machine. So we're going to do it by hand with our stab back stitch. I have a single strand of extra strong thread with a knot in the end in a matching colour. And I'm going to start just anywhere on one of the side panels here, and I'm going to bring my needle up on the underside, and I'm just going to travel the length of 1 stitch, and I've come in at the 4mm seam allowance, and now I'm going to just go straight over the top of that stitch again, just to reinforce that. So 2 stitches, one on top of the other, and then we're going to just travel along on the underside Again, keeping the stitches nice and small, and then I'm going to go back into my last exit hole. So this is called a stab back stitch, because we stab all the way through and back again. Now I'm now going to come from the underside again, travel the length of another stitch and back into the last exit hole. So the stitch is fully linked back and front. It's very, very strong because of that, and also because we're using extra strong thread. And when you use this stitch, you have so much control over the seam, and you can sew a beautiful clean shape, in this case a circle, and keep to your seam allowance. So I'm just going to continue on with that stitch all the way around till I meet up at the other side. Okay, so that has that neck circle all stitched in with my stab back stitch, and the final thing that we need to do is add the tail to this little horse. And before I do that, this opening around the tail that we've left open, I've taken a doubled strand of extra strong thread and I've sewn a close little running stitch just about 3 millimeters in from the edge, and then followed around in the little circle shape under here, around back to the top again. I've left my tail ends hanging and I've tied 1 knot. So there's a little hole there, and I've got a running stitch all the way around so I can draw in around it. So you need to take your little bunch of whatever you're using for the tail, and I have wrapped that up with thread and I've passed through it, stitching it so everything will hold together. And I just need to tuck this end through this hole here. And forceps can certainly help you do that. Just take it in and tuck it through, and I've just brought it to just where that line of stitching is. I've got my needle still on here, and I can pull on those thread ends and really pull it in super tight around that tail. I will knot that off about 4 times, and then because I still have my needle on, I will pass it through a few times just to make sure that that's really secure. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and turn the whole body through and roll out all of those seams. So there we have the beautiful little base body of our little horse with a little tail connected at the back there, and we can put this one aside. We will unravel that tail later. Now we're going to work on the saddle. So the saddle, we have the outer pieces of the saddle that have the decorative heart on them, then the inside underside of the saddle. I've made them 2 different colours, you don't have to. And now we're going to first of all put right sides together with these, with each pair, and we're going to line up this top edge on both of them. And then we are going to sew that seam with that same 4 millimeter seam allowance. Going to overcast it first and then sew that seam 2 times, same on this one. And then I'm going to remove my overcasting stitch, and I'm actually going to press that seam on each open and flat. Also, of course, I neglected to say, of course, that you have to iron on your little heart shape. I'd already done mine, so press those on with your hot iron and protective cloth, and then you'll do that same stitching around it that we did with our other patches. The distance between the base of the heart and the edge of your saddle is 1.5 centimetres. That situates it perfectly on that piece, and make sure that it's centred. So I now have both of those stitched together at that top centre seam, and press those seams open and flat on both those pieces. You do need to add the little ties that you're going to use to tie that saddle under the body. So whatever it is that you're using, I'm just using a coordinating ribbon, and you need to sew just a length. This is probably about 40 centimetres. It's more than I need, I can trim it back. And I've just popped that right sides together on the edge going inside. So we're going to tuck that in as we sew the 2 pieces together. I've just stitched within the seam allowance to keep that in place, and now we're going to put right sides together. And you have marks on your pattern piece here and here. This is a section that you leave open, so you need to line everything up, and particularly those center seams. So a clip on that center seam is a really good idea, and same the opposite side. You can bring these pieces out through that opening so they're out of the way, but do make sure that you're not going to get that caught up in the sewing. So don't have it pulling up here, make sure it's coming down and out of that opening. Same the other side. And we're going to pin and overcast all the way around from this mark all the way around to this mark, and then you're going to sew that seam. You only need to sew that seam once because we're not stuffing it, and you need to go back and forth on your start and finish because we're going to need to turn that through, which is exactly what you can do once you have stitched it. So that has my two saddle pieces stitched together in the center, and then those seams pressed nice and flat. On the underside piece, you need to add your ribbon or whatever braid you're using for your ties that will tie the saddle under the body. I'm just using this stitched ribbon, and I've just stitched right sides together on the within the seam allowance with the ribbon coming inwards on both sides, just at the base there, so that when we put these together, we're going to be able to sew all the way around and leave this section open here, which is exactly what we're going to do now. So you want to make sure that those ribbon pieces aren't going to get caught up in any seams, so take them through and up and out. And you particularly want to line up your center seams, and a clip is the best way to do that. Clamp that down on both sides so that saddle section will be beautifully lined up, and then you can clip or pin all the way around, and we're going to simply go ahead. I will overcast it all first, and we're going to leave this section open. Do go back and forth on your start and finish when you stitch it. You only have to sew it once because we're not stuffing it. Once you've sewn that, turn that through and give it a good roll between your fingers, and then we're going to give it a press. So once you have turned this one through and you've really rolled out all of those seams and got all those beautiful curves in, rolled it out, give it a good press. When you're pressing it, you want to turn under the openings so that they're folded over. And now I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to stitch a close top stitch to the edge, probably only about 5 millimeters, all the way around, and as I do that, of course, it will close that opening. And there we go, that completes our little saddle, all top stitched. Everything's beautiful and neat, and that will tie up beautifully underneath that belly there. So we will put this all together when we've made the head. So let's get started on the head by making the ears. So I already have one of the little ears already made up here, and remember I said I've got the same body colour on the back and then a nice pink interior. You can use any colour scheme you like. Putting right sides together here, and we are going to be sewing. We've got marks on your pattern templates that show you where to sew from. We start, this is the opening, but we start here with our overcasting at this mark, and you want to overcast that whole lower edge back into the mark at the other side. The reason why we come in a little is it gives us a cleaner point here to work with. Very hard to tuck edges under on a very small piece when you're just coming straight down. It's a lot to turn under on that corner, so it just makes sense to make it up like this. So I'm just going to go around as I said, and when you go to sew that on the machine, you will use a smaller seam allowance if you can. So as small as you can make it. Mine was probably about 2.5 millimeter. It just cuts down the bulk on the inside and certainly on the corners. And do make sure that you reinforce back and forth on each corner, because when we go to poke that corner through, it needs to be really strong. So get that one overcast, stitched on the machine. You only need to sew it once because we're not stuffing it, then you can turn it through. Now that I have that one all turned through, and I've been very careful to really push out those corners fully, I'm going to add another step here that you don't have to do, but I like to do it. I like to take a little bit of clear craft glue, on the end of a wooden skewer. I'm going to take it in to the ear and just smear it on the top half, right up into that peak there, not on the bottom half, but the top half of the ear, and that will help me seal those two pieces together. It just helps cup that ear when we go to sew it on. As I said, you don't have to do this, but it's something that I think really makes a big difference. It means that those edges, those pieces stay together. When you cup the ear, it stops it from puffing out, and I think it does give you a better ear shape. So I will just let that dry, make sure that they are nicely sealed. This is the look. So when I curl that ear, it stays together up here. Okay, but you don't want glue down here because we have to close this opening. Once this is dry, I will then just take my needle and I will use my extra strong thread and just turn those edges under and slip stitch that opening closed. So now the ears are done, we're going to move on to actually putting the head together. So first of all, with your side head pieces, these main pieces here, you can add any kind of patches and detail that you want to. What you have to remember is to keep those patches away from seams and closings. So make sure they're well isolated so that they stand out beautifully. Nothing looks worse than badly placed patches that are interfering with seams and so on. It needs to look quite clean and flawless. So I've popped my patch right at the side of the head. Again, in my original illustration, he had a little patch here like this. I'm not putting anything on the other side of the head. I don't do matchy-matchy like that. I have done that a little on the body, but not on the head. You can also do a little bit, some darning stitches. And when this is all put together, I will be doing some darning stitches on the head once it's all filled. Okay, because it's easier to do it on seam lines that way. So what we're going to do first is, now that I have that all in place, I'm going to add my muzzle pieces, and I will work on the side head piece to do that, and I'm going to overcast those into place, and then I will stitch that 4mm seam allowance 2 times, just as we have with all the other seams. Go ahead and press those seams out, roll the seams out nice and flat, and you want the seam to be going forwards. Everything will sit better if the seam is going forwards, so do that with both of them. Then we're going to put right sides together again, and the seam we're going to sew now is that chin seam. So you want to line up at the base here where you have that join to make sure that they're perfectly lined up. Pop a clip on there. Then I'm going to overcast all the way down to the neck edge, and I'm going to sew that seam 2 times with that same 4mm seam allowance. Again, you can go ahead and roll out that seam once you have stitched that 2 times, and I also remove my overcasting stitch from this curve because, again, everything sits better and is easier to get a gusset in nice and straight if that's open. We're now going to take that head gusset, and as we have before at our points, we're going to take our pin through at our 4mm seam allowance, and we're going to take it through, again, 4mm seam allowance straight through that centre seam. We're then going to pin in that 3D fashion again. I'm going to go from side to side to make sure that I'm getting that in evenly. Pulling those edges around, and I'm only going to pin up till this mark. Now this mark, these 2 marks here, the mark on your centre gusset and the mark on your side head piece, should match up beautifully. So pin those into place. And again, if you've kept your seam allowances, this piece will fit in absolutely perfectly. So we don't go any further than that, we just line up those pieces. You can see that gusset is going to fit in well. And then we're just going to overcast from that mark to that mark all the way around. So there you can see I have that front section of the muzzle just hand stitched in with our overcasting stitch. Now there are no you know, quick fixes when adding a muzzle to any kind of soft sculpture animal. This is the perfect way to get a straight muzzle, and there's no quick fast track way to do it. You must anchor in that front, you have to anchor in those sides and line them up, and you definitely have to hand stitch it into place. The other thing is that you need to hand stitch that front section into place by hand, because if you try and do this on the machine, there's no way you're going to get that beautiful shape, and this is usually the focal part of your animal. So I have now a single strand of extra strong thread, and I'm going to start right here on my mark at my 4mm seam allowance, and I'm going to do 2 stitches, one on top of the other, as we did before when we were sewing in that next circle. So this is our stab back stitch again, and I'm then going to continue on coming up from the underneath, keeping those stitches nice and small and even, and going back into my last exit hole. Pulling those stitches nice and firm, travelling along again, and like I said, with this stitch you can get the perfect line, much better than on a machine. So we will use the machine when we do the back of the head, the side head pieces of the gusset, but for this section I hand sew in every single muzzle of any animal and any project that I do, and I will make my way around. Again, when we get to the center point here, do 2 stitches either side of that center point to fully lock it in, and 2 stitches when you finish off. When you sew in a centre front nose gusset, always at this point turn it through and roll out all of those seams and check that you've caught everything, and check that it is all nice and even. You can see that's perfectly straight and it's even here. So now we can pop that back through, and we're going to finish sewing the head by taking our pins or our clips, pinning that side head seam, following those curves all the way down to the back of the neck edge. Now throughout this too, please note that I've been working on the centre head gusset to do all of this work. You would never put in a centre head gusset working from the side panels. Always pinning, sewing on that centre head gusset. I'm going to take this one all the way down. It will meet up perfectly. You can see there at the side, no easing required. With my patterns, they all fit perfectly, provided you've stayed with that seam allowance. Pin that one all the way down, you'll overcast it, and then you can link it up with this stitching and sew 2 times on the machine, turn it around, and you'll do the same with the opposite side all the way down, still working on that centre head gusset, and that seam allowance is 4mm. You can go ahead and turn that head through once you have stitched those side seams, and take your time and roll them all out, because you want this very well rolled out before we start adding stuffing. So now we are going to fill this head, and it needs to be filled super firm, because we are going to be adding our eyes and the little mouth detail, and you need a really firm head to be able to handle that, because we're going to be pulling in on that mouth. If you don't have this packed rock solid, it's just going to crumple in and won't give you that good shape. So polyester filling, of course, I'm going to take that right in and start by filling the muzzle area nice and firm. I will also use my forceps to help me do that stuffing. to really pack it in. And also I have my wool felting needle ready, and that will help me pack it in as well. And when I say that it needs to be packed firm, there shouldn't be any give in it hardly at all, okay? Because when we add those eyes as well, we're going to need that to be able to cope with the stress we're going to add by pulling on those buttons. Otherwise you'll just have it collapse and it will be this skinny little head in the middle. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead, get that head filled until about 1 centimetre or so from the edge here, about 1.5 centimetres, and you want to pack that filling in and make a nice flat surface ready to take our neck joint. Okay, so that has that head filled, and you can see everything is filled out, all these beautiful curves. It is absolutely rock solid. You can see what I mean? There's no give here. Okay, and that gives us our beautiful cheeks pulled out. Make sure when you're filling that you're filling those cheeks out as well. When you're stuffing anything in soft sculpture, you are not just filling a hole, you are sculpting with that filling. So keep stopping and having a look, making sure you're getting everything straight. Okay, so then next step is to take a double strand of extra strong thread. You start at the back, about 5 millimeters in from the neck edge. You're going to sew a running stitch all the way around until you get back. You leave your tail ends hanging and make 1 knot. Also, you'll notice that the filling, the stuffing, I've gone in there and flattened that out, so we've got a lovely flat surface there to add our neck joint, which we'll be doing now. And I'm just going to take that. So just going to slip that neck joint in there, and of course if you're using my system, these bolts are glued to your disc. Push that one in and it should be a lovely snug fit. And now I'm going to go ahead and pull on those thread ends. And I want to get that fabric pulled in as tight around that bolt as I can. Now if you don't have someone you can have to put their finger on that knot, just use your forceps to clamp that knot shut and then do your 2nd, 3rd and 4th knots. I leave my needle on because then I like to go around the 2nd time and tie it off again, so it's very, very secure. So now we are ready to stitch in the mouth, which is just a simple double strand thread of pearl thread. I'm using 5-ply because it's a little bit thicker, and we're going to just be stitching that mouth line in like that. And you can see there that I've checked my placement with pins. That's the best way to do it, where you can see where you're going to have some pull in, a little bit of a smile. Don't take it all the way to the end here, leave a nice space here. And we are going to take that double strand of pearl thread on our largest doll needle, and I've threaded through the single ends. The reason for doing that is if you make a mistake with your placement, if you've threaded it through like this and you're using it just like you would a normal single strand of thread, you can take your needle out and fix that stitch without having to cut it off and start all over again. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in underneath the neck here. I'm looking to bring my needle out right on one of those pin marks that I've made, but I've got a knot in the end that's going to hold nicely. And then I'm going to dive back in to that same hole, and I'm going to travel across to bring my needle out this side, right where my pin is. It can take a few goes to get there. You want it right on that spot. Take that out and bring my needle through. I'm going to test that that is all holding because I'm really going to put some pressure on this. Now I'm going to make sure that I've got my strands of thread not twisted. I'm going to place that stitch exactly where I want it and really put some pressure on because I want it to pull in that mouth area a little. So you can imagine what would happen if you didn't have it firmly stuffed. It would just completely collapse. So here's my mark on the other side. I'm going to dive in with my needle. And I'm going to exit down the base here again, come out right on the edge of my disc template down here, pull that all the way through. I'm going to check again that I haven't twisted those threads. Again, give it some real tension. Make sure it's placed where I want it. And pull on those thread ends. Really pull down, really anchor that stitch in. And then keeping up that tension, I'm going to take my needle again, I'm going to travel across and I'm going to anchor that, sewing it with a couple of stitches around that neck edge. So that will keep up that tension. This is going to be held in place. We're not going to have any issues with anything becoming slack. So here is our little horse head with that little smile all tucked in there nicely. We are now going to move ahead and do the eyes. Now for me, I'm using buttons for eyes, and also I'm using eye tester pins that are the same size as my buttons. These are 18mm tester eyes. You can use smaller buttons than this. This was my other option, just a smaller blue button. But when it came down to it, I think that this is more accurate to my drawing and I like the size of them and the fact that it's got a little bit of red there. So I have tested those. I've pushed in to give me a good idea of how they're going to look when they're pulled in. That's about right. Remember that horses' eyes, they sit on the side of their head. They're not sort of at the front looking at you. So I've then gone ahead and made my marks on the side there. And I have my needle with a double strand of extra strong thread. I'm stitching mine on with red to match my illustration. You can certainly use any thread that works for your project. I want a very homemade kind of looking animal here, so that's why I'm going for the red. Now I always start at the base and I anchor my thread first of all, because it's really important. We're going to put a lot of pressure on these buttons and I want this thread to hold. So I'm going to first just do a couple of stitches on the underside here at the base. It's going to make sure that knot is going to hold. It can handle anything that I do here. I take my needle through. And then I'm going to dive in that same hole and I'm going to bring my needle out at one of my eye spots. And take a little bit of time to find that spot. I'm going to try and hit just on the outer edge of it because it's a 4-hole button that I'm using. And pull that all the way through. And I know that anything that as hard as I can pull on that, it's not going to pull away. Okay, so now I'm going to take my first button, come through the back of it, take my needle through the opposite hole, and I'm going to pass through the head and bring my needle out through that other side, right where that mark is. I'm using my fine medium sized doll needle here. It's just easier to negotiate. Pull that through. We want to make sure that nothing's twisted as that's going in and that all your threads are pulled in correctly. Just unwind that. And you can pull on both those threads independently too, because sometimes they can get caught up. There we go, so that's nice and firm. Now while that looks nice while it's sitting on top like that, if I really pull it in, I'm going to get a lovely pulled in, more of a realistic little look. It's just more pleasing. Okay, so now I repeat with the other button on the other side. I'm going to come through the back of it, go back through the front of it. I'm going to dive in here, and I'm going to travel across and come out through my button again, and I'll come out this time in one of the other holes. And then I'm just going to go back and forth through the head, and as I do so, I'm going to be squeezing those eyes in and really keeping up that tension. So these eyes are going to be squeezing in together. Just make sure that it's even. I will go through quite a few times, possibly up to 8 times. When I've got them exactly where I want them, I'll take my needle in, I'll come out down the back here, out the base, and then knot off underneath like I have before. And so there you can see those eyes popped in, and you can see how lovely it looks with those eyes pulled in. It really gives it some beautiful definition. Okay, so my next step will be to do exactly the same thing to create nostrils. Now this is optional, you don't have to add nostrils, but I'm just going to do the same thing with 2 small yellow buttons. I don't want them to really stand out, that's why I'm going for yellow, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to mark in that position, and it is just below that curve here. I can use my eye tester pins again to get the positioning right, and then I'll do the same thing with yellow thread, and I'll pass to and fro just to pull them in. There we go, so that's adding the 2 little nostrils, and I think that's a lovely effect. Now I will, because this is to go with my art piece, I will be airbrushing this horse just very slightly, but let me tell you where you can add your colour. So if you want to do a little bit of colour, you can use artist soft pastels, you could use alcohol markers, or if you do have an airbrushing kit you can do that. I will simply shade around the outer lower edge of the eyes, each of the eyes, around the lower edge of the nostrils, and just under the mouth line here, and just here and there, just to show a little bit of wear and tear, a little bit of colour up inside the ears, but that's about all I'll do. So you'll see that at the end. But I will go ahead now, and we're going to sew the ears on last. So we're now going to get started with putting this one together. Before we put the head on to the body, we need to add our weight. It's much easier to add that weight filling before we actually add the head. So I take my little makeshift funnel here that I've just made with a little bit of cardboard, and I've got my clean aquarium gravel. Basically what I'm looking to do is just cover the base, and you might be doing this with another, some other product. You might be doing it with plastic pellets. Anything that just gives it a bit of weight will be fine. Mine of course is an artist collectible, it's not going to be played with or anything like that. And I'm just going to cover the whole base, make sure it's nice and even. That way it's not going to move. You can perch things on top of it. Of course this one is having a little bear, and you want it to sit nicely. Let me just have a look in there. I need just a little bit more. And once I've done that, then I can add the head. I certainly don't want it to be too heavy, I just want it to be able to be stable. And it really does need to coat the whole bottom. You can settle that in nice and flat. Put that aside. Now we can go ahead and add our head. We're going to do that by putting that bolt straight through. I'm going to add my corresponding disc on the underside. I can feel it. And then my washer. And my nut. And I'm just going to finger tighten at this stage, as we always do, just to make sure I've got everything right before I really tighten that up. I do want this neck joint to be fairly poseable, but I want to check first of all that everything is pulled out from between those two layers and that joint is free moving. I can then get in there with my spanner and I will tighten that up until I can just physically move it with my fingers, and over time that will slacken a little bit. So you always do it a little bit tighter than you would actually need. But just make sure that everything's centered with that neck circle. It gives you a perfect fluid joint by having that neck circle there. So get that all tightened up and then add one little drop of super glue just in on the underside of the nut where it's on the bolt, just into the threads of the bolt where the two join. I can't really sort of show you here. It's a bit almost impossible. Don't even know, I won't be able to show you, but it's just in there. You've seen me do this before. Drop of super glue and it will stop that nut from ever coming adrift. So now with that head all joined there and that nut has been secured, we can go ahead, make sure that weight is well distributed nice and evenly on the base, and then you can go ahead and start filling the rest of the body. So I will be using my forceps to get in here to do this, to fill every single area. Now this one needs to be filled nice and firm. There will be a certain amount of give in the bottom because of that weight, but you need to really support up around the neck, so right up under here to keep that head lifted up. That needs to be packed super firm. Also, again, when we're thinking about the shape of this one, if you just randomly throw stuffing in there, you'll end up with a flattened kind of a ball. We need it to be this nice shape that comes up and is wider at the bottom. So it's more pointed at the top. So keep to that shape. Remember to fill out the base of that tail and all of your corners. Forceps will certainly help you to do that. You'll be able to get right in there in those corners if you've got larger forceps. Much easier to tuck in all of that filling. Fill it right up to the top here. Use your wool felting needle again to tap all of that in place. Then we're going to come back and close that opening. Okay, so now you can see I've got my little horse all filled out. Now the important parts to remember are, don't fill it so tight that you lose that nice settling on the bottom where your little horse can be wiggled into place like that. That weight will keep it stable. But you do need, see that there's no give around here. Everything else is pushed out. Push out all of those beautiful curves. And don't forget coming in here and up and lifting that little bottom up here. So I've got it filled out enough that I can still squeeze that opening closed. I can always take filling out as I go or add more if I like. I am going to start with this ladder stitch to close. So I've got a matching thread extra strong, one strand, a big pile of knots in the end. I'm going to come in right up here where this seam starts to open out. A little bit tricky, the positioning, and I'm coming in at the seam allowance, which of course is 4 millimeters. So that knot will hold. I will travel straight across, dive in the opposite side at the seam allowance, and I will take, I'm actually going to change my needle here. I'm going to change to a curved needle because it makes going in and out so much easier on a three-dimensional project. So there's my curved needle. If you ever wondered what they're for, this is exactly where they come into their own. So now I can take my needle, it'll go in and come out much easier. So I'm just traveling the length of one stitch for now. Pull that needle through. So I've got one stitch going across. Give that a little squeeze, that'll pull in. I'm then going to go back to my start point, my actual start point where the knot is sitting below that surface. And now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to travel down in my seam allowance just the length of one stitch, keeping it the same as the opposite side. and pull that through. Give that a little squeeze and that will start to pull in. I go back across to the other side and again go in the last exit hole, take a stitch, give it a squeeze and it will pull in. Remember too that our saddle covers this completely. Back to the other side, we're going to do the same thing. Again, take one stitch. You can see how that curved needle really helps you scoop in and out. And each time I'm giving that seam a squeeze and pulling those edges together. I'm going to continue to do that, pulling in every time, make my way down to the base here. I will finish off with a simple knot on the surface in that seam, make a knot, take my needle in and sink that knot. I have a video on Pay It Forward that gives you a close-up look on doing a ladder closing stitch. You can check that out if that helps you. So let me get that one all closed up. Okay, so you can see there that I've gone ahead and I've added the little saddle. I've simply tied it underneath the body there and that's nice and firm. You can see it's a perfect fit. Our next step is to add the ears. Not my favourite job. I don't think anybody's favourite job, but it does have to be done. So let me show you that there's a really special way to pin ears on. First of all, because it's a horse, even though it's a little toy horse, the ears have to be in the right position, which is an upright, perky kind of position. If you sew the ears on like this, it's no longer a horse, or it's certainly it's an unusual horse. So they do need to be pinned on correctly. So your first pin goes through the front seam in the front corner of the ear and you want to take it in. It's going to sit, you can see where it is in relation to the eye there. So you find the sweet spot, you put ears on enough and you'll realise just exactly where they need to sit. They can't be too far forward and they can't be too far back. I know that sounds simple, but it's true. Okay, so my first pin goes in, but what I want to do is I want to over angle the direction of the pin to be going in this way. That's going to help pull the top of the ear up. Then we're going to pull that ear back, get our next pin and pop that in. It's probably just over 1 centimetre along and I take that in also on that angle and it's gone in still keeping on that seam line. Then we take the bottom and we curl it around, still keeping that ear nice and upright. So taking my pin and into the side of the head. Now that I've got that all where I want it, I'm going to reinforce that by adding pins in behind. You can pin the entire lower edge of that ear. And have a really good look at that. Now that ear is sitting up nice and perky, it's sitting up nice and straight, and we've got a nice curl around to the ear. So all I have to do is match the ear up on the other side. You might also notice there I did a couple of darning stitches on that head, so you can do any extra little stitches that you like, and it's just the same as how we added the eyes and the nose. You take your thread, you come in from behind, make your stitches and cast off out the back of the head. So just a few little extra things there that I have added, but you can see that ear sitting in a beautiful position. I'm just going to match the other one up on the opposite side. There we go. So that has those two ears perfectly lined up and balanced, and do look at them from every angle to make sure that they're right and lined up. Now we're going to sew them on. I have a very long piece of strand of my extra strong thread, a knot in the end. It's a single strand and I'm using my medium fine doll needle. I'm going to start at the back of the head here, just coming in here, and I want to bring my needle out right where that pin goes into the head at the front. right at the very front there, and as I pull that through, the knot will sit on the surface unless I just slightly enlarge that entry hole. That's going to allow that knot to pop into the head so that it won't be seen. It's not agreeing with me. There we go. So that knot is in and hidden. And now I'm going to take my needle, and I'm going to take my needle straight through where that pin is. I'm going to go into the head. I'm going to travel down to the base of the ear where the other pin is at the front of the ear. So I'm going to pass through the fabric and the stuffing of the head and bring it right out there, right where that pin sits. Can take a few goes to get it exactly where you want it, and pull that one through. So straight away you can see that that's going to pull the top edge of that ear down. You want to keep that tension up. I'm going to dive in to the base of the ear. I'm going to travel back to my start point. Right there, same point, bring that through. And pull on those thread ends. Keep it all nice and taut. Then I'm going to dive back in again, same spot, and we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to travel back down, and I'm going to do this back and forth on the base top, the top of the ear and the base of the ear here. I'm going to go back and forth at least 3 times, and that will totally secure the top and the base of the ear into place. So you'll notice that we're sewing these into the stuffing of the head. We're not just sewing it on the surface of the fabric, because if we do that, that ear is like on a hinge and it can move, and we don't want it to move. So true soft sculpture is sculpted into the head. So now I'm going back up again, coming back out at that same point. Each time, pulling that in, going to go back again, and then I'm going to come back up, and my final stitch will be coming out at the top. Okay, so my thread's at the top now, and I've been able to take out my 2 pins at the top and the base. So now I'm going to take my needle in again, the top of the ear, but I'm just going in from behind, and I'm just travelling along just a little way, and I'm going to bring my needle out at the base of the ear, but also travelling along a little way on that ear curve at the base. There we go, and pull that through. Always watching while you're sewing that you're keeping your pins pushed down and you're not losing that great ear set. So now I'm going to dive back into the base of the ear. I'm travelling again, just a little way along. Come up to the other side here, again travelling a little way along that ear curve at the base. Making sure each time that you're passing through the head. So now all I have to do is continue that process of going back and forth through the head, moving a little as I go each time until the whole base of the ear is stitched in place. Once you get to this back area here, for ears that you want to sit upright, the key point is back here. So you have to make sure, you see how I pull on that pin, that it pulls that ear up. So you have to make sure that that is fully anchored in. When you get back to about here with your stitching, you can dive in and come out at the base and back again, dive in and come out at the top and back again. When you're finished, the ear is secure, just come out at the back of the head, somewhere on that seam line, just make a surface knot, dive your needle in and lose that knot. That's it. That's the most simple way to sew on ears. As far as ears go, these are pretty easy to sew on because everything's visible. And then go ahead and make sure that you stitch the other one in the same way. Watch that they're looking nicely pulled up. To my masterclass people, you could put warbler in these ears, thermoplastic moulding, you can certainly do that. But for the sake of showing you that you can do it without it, you still get a great result. So there we go, we've got ears sewn on, and now I have unravelled all of those tail pieces, you can see, and I've trimmed that tail back. I will probably take a little bit more length off of that tail so that it just sits nicely on the ground there. And I have made a tiny little bridle. So let me show you how to do that. Very, very simple. I've made that just with some ribbon and a couple of little split rings. These are probably, I would suggest they're about 12mm. Thereabouts, that will be near enough anyway. And I've just taken my hot glue and I've measured first a piece to go over the top of the muzzle and then underneath, and I have simply cut and hot glued those into place to fit that muzzle nice and snug because I want it to hold there, and then added my strap piece and slip that on. You want those little rings to sit there just nicely at the side, and you do want this to be tight enough to hold itself there. Then we've got our little reins to sit back there. The final thing I'm going to do with this one, aside from a little bit of airbrush shading around the nostrils and the eyes, which is all I'll do with shading, is I'm going to make a tiny little bandana that will just look so sweet and just really finish off that neckline. Okay, so let's make up this little bandana. This is really simple. So I've taken 2 pieces of print fabric that works with my project. I want to bring out a little bit of the red highlighting and then that contrasting going with the blue spots again. Now you trace around, you put right sides together, 2 pieces of fabric large enough to accommodate your pattern template, which I've given you. You just need to trace around that template and put in your marks for the openings. You then take this to your machine and you start at the beginning of one of those opening marks, and you will stitch all the way around the entire edge back to this mark here. Make sure you go back and forwards on your start and finish, then we'll come back and cut it out. This is the quickest, easiest way to deal with a small shape like this. Once you have stitched that, you can go ahead and just trim away the excess fabric and leave just about a 4 to 5mm seam allowance all the way around, including where that opening is. And I also like to take the corners off of any of the points. So just here. Just be careful not to cut into your stitching on the point at the front. Then you can go ahead and turn it through. Make sure you push out all of those lovely corners. Turn it through this opening here and give it a good press. When you're pressing it out, as you're pressing it out, turn that opening edge under. So I'll get in there with my knitting needle to carefully push out all of those corners. Give me that lovely little shape. And when I press it all, I'll just turn those edges under. Once you have pressed that out, then you can go ahead and sew a top stitch right close to the edge, just a couple of millimeters in from the edge all the way around. Then you want to fold and then you'll stitch it, and that will close that opening. So then you want to fold your little bandana over, and just don't fold it all the way. Just reveal some of the underside colour. It just gives you that little pop of colour on the bottom. And then you can sew in a little hemline. Just make it wide enough for you to thread through your chosen ribbon or tie, whatever you're going to use, to tie that around your horse's neck. So whichever works for you. I could even use some of the rope that I used on his tail. I'll have a look at that and see what I think. But just a small hemline and then get that ribbon threaded through. And there we go. I've gone with a little blue ribbon, the same ribbon I used on the reins and bridle. So there we go. That's ready to tie around my little horse's neck. I'm going to do my final airbrushing, pop this on and show you the finished result. So this completes our beautiful little horse. We'll call it a little hobby horse. I have just added, of course, the little reins, added that bandana, tied on that saddle. Everything's finished except for I'm going to do a little bit of airbrushing around the button eyes and the button nostrils. Everything else I'll leave the same. You can, if you want that little tail to sit up like a little dressage tail like I have here. So it's got the little sit up there. Just take some twine or some more of what you've used in your yarn and just strap it, just wrap it around just like they would in a dressage horse. Tie that off and you've got that lovely little flouncy little tail, which I really love. So there we go. So what do you think? How many people are going to be making this beautiful little horse? I think it's going to be an absolute crowd pleaser. I have to say I am super excited for all of the different colorways. I know that so many of you are truly talented with color and putting color together. Also remember to put your own spin on this little horse. You can make it absolutely vintage, you can make it quite rustic, just beautiful. So if you want to make a cowboy, of course, to go with it, you're going to have to come and join Masterclass. All of those links are down below, and also remember on our Facebook page, if you come and join our Facebook page, I do have a beautiful free PDF downloadable printout for you of the original illustration that I drew that was the inspiration for this design. So great little print for nurseries, children's rooms and so on. You could even give it as a gift. Just a whole lot of fun there. It prints up really, really well. It's high definition. So I hope you enjoy that. So in the meantime, everybody, have a fantastic creative week. Come and share those beautiful creations on our Facebook page. I'll look forward to seeing them. Remember, everybody, to keep on paying all of those good things forward. Until next time, it is hooroo from me.